Great. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us here at the Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, October 21st, 2024. And I will call this meeting to order a little late at 1:07 p.m. And begin by acknowledging with gratitude that we live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Squamish, whose people have been stewards of these lands and waters surrounding Laleham, Bowen Island from time immemorial. First item today is approval of the agenda. I'll look to the corporate officer for the addition of any late items today.
There was one late item that was circulated by email and also added to the agenda, and that is a letter from Donald Youngson regarding item 4.1.
Thank you. And with that, I will look for a motion that the Committee of the Whole approve the agenda and late items for the October 21st, 2024 Committee of the Whole, moved by Councillor Getty, seconded by Councillor Fast. All in favor, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
And that carries unanimously. Moving on to our first item in 3.1 delegations, the Housing Advisory Committee and Bowen Island Resilient Community Housing report regarding a proposal for the community-owned housing organization. Who is joining us here today from HAC and Birch? Hello.
Just realized I did make a very short PowerPoint. It's not critical, but I realized I did not communicate that to you. So I don't know if there's a possibility to get it there or you're in the Zoom meeting. Yeah. You can share your screen. You could spare me a moment to do that. Do you want me to do a quick intro? I know you likely know who you are, but.
Sure. I'm David. This is Robin. Robin Benson is Birch's executive director, a longtime staff member and engine of the organization. I'm David McCullum. I'm the board chair. My job is to support Robin.
Sorry.
I'm gonna tap dance while we get Wi-Fi connectivity.
Maybe it's not that important. It really is just reiterating the report. So why don't I just jump in, and if it's helpful, I think the report's in all your agenda. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it was really just to highlight some of the points. So this is the report that was done by the Housing Advisory Committee, our working group, and it was all the proper terms received at our last meeting in September, and then made recommendations made to bring it to this setting. And I do want to again reiterate, I said this at our committee meeting, just declaring very clearly a conflict of interest. So I'm the chair of the Housing Advisory Committee. I'm also, as you mentioned, the executive director of Birch. And there certainly is a chance that decisions made today may financially benefit me potentially in the future. So I just want to make that very clear, but it also has not had any influence on the recommendations we've made. And one of those that I just wanted to make extra clear was, before we submitted this report to the committee, I reviewed it with the Birch board because we knew there's a possibility Birch may be involved. And we very specifically removed Birch from any part of the report. We wanted to keep it generic because really the recommendation is for a nonprofit, which we'll get into. After when it was presented at the meeting and I recused myself, the Housing Advisory Committee added Birch back in specifically. So I'll let Councillor Waite maybe speak to that if there are questions about it, but I just wanted to be very, very clear. I'd like to make those statements more rather than not enough. I'll just give very quick highlight because I think everybody's seen it. It is essentially, we spoke with Don Lidstone. He said there's generally two structures: nonprofit society, housing authority. There's pros and cons for both, which I can definitely get into or clarify, answer questions. But essentially his recommendation, based on what most municipalities are doing these days, is to go with the nonprofit. We have a great example of Squamish is kind of the most recent that Tim, I know, has been chatting with them, and we have some resources from them. And then there is outlined also in the report what the municipality's role would be going forward with this recommended nonprofit model, which is potentially having a councillor sit on the board, still having sort of that level of involvement, but very much being arm's length and not directing it. Yeah, and the only thing I'm gonna add that wasn't actually in the report that came up through some questions that I thought might be, I hope is useful, is that the municipality, according to the information I could find, has invested about $45,000 in Birch since 2019, and that's in community grants and those and such. So for our operational funds. I actually don't have a count of how many hours we've done. I have approximations, but between myself and the board, it's safe to say it's over 1,000 hours in those 5 years and more. And we leveraged that $45,000 into pre-development funds of $200,000 for the Miller Road project. And now that that's been funded by BC Housing, I don't have an exact number, but it's over $2 million. I think it's in the 2.2, 2.4 million range as investment in the community for housing, for affordable housing. So we are thankful and grateful, and we feel that it was a very good investment on the part of the municipality. Yeah, I guess we're basically just here to, well, I'm here to answer any questions about the report. David and I are here if you have any questions about Birch, because that was the recommendation from the Housing Advisory Committee.
Thank you. Look to council for any questions, comments. Seeing none? Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for presenting your.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
And so moving on to staff reports 4.1 on a same issue, community-owned housing organization background. We have our manager of planning and development here today, Daniel Martin.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. So I'm here to provide some additional background in terms of this report that came from our Housing Advisory Committee to set the stage a bit for Mayor and Council. So first, my report sort of lays out some of the background of how this report came about, that this wasn't something that the Housing Advisory Committee sort of came up with by themselves, but Council's strategic plan, the 2024 update, contemplated this action. So create a working group to explore establishing a community-owned housing organization. And then Council specifically directed the Housing Advisory Committee at your May 27th meeting to create a working group to establish a community-owned housing organization. So that working group was formed in June, met through the summer, met as Robin said with their legal counsel, and came back with a report at their September meeting, which has been referred to this committee of the whole for discussion. So you have in your agenda package the recommendation from the Housing Advisory Committee. Yeah, and then so my report then, just by way of background, it talks about a couple other things. So as Robin mentioned, give some examples: the Squamish Community Housing Society and the Sunshine Coast Affordable Housing Society. So that's one of the things that the working group learned in talking with the legal review with Don Woodstone, was just examples of where this has been successfully done. The idea that municipalities, especially smaller municipalities, typically are not following the sort of housing corporation, municipally owned housing organization model, but instead this model of partnering with either an existing or creating a new affordable housing society. So Squamish, Timely just re-upped their agreements. They had an initial 3-year partnership. They initially provided a certain amount of funding a year, and then they increased it in 2024, in part because of funding from their Housing Accelerator Fund grant. And then they just entered a new 5-year agreement with a mix of funding models, but at a higher level. So they saw that this model was successful for them. The other interesting example is Sunshine Coast Affordable Housing Society, where it was actually a partnership between the District of Sechelt, the Town of Gibsons, and the Sunshine Coast Regional District, so all 3 together, to provide that operational funding for the housing society. And then the individual municipalities then entering into agreements in terms of development. So Town of Gibsons, you'll see a couple developments have taken place there. So the 3 local governments providing that sort of core funding for that and partnership for the housing society, and then working with individual local governments to develop housing depending on where the location and where the funding is. And so similar to Squamish in terms of receiving a Housing Accelerator Fund funding from CMHC. So Bowen, as you know, was successful in our grant application. We'll receive up to $1.6 million in funding through that grant agreement. The funding is based on the permitting of dwelling units on Bowen Island, so our ability to actually deliver building permits for dwelling units. And if we don't, if there's a lesser level of housing development on Bowen, our grant amount will probably be clawed back. And secondly, the ability of us to complete items in the action plan that was in our grant application. And one of these items was partnering with nonprofits on affordable housing. So the way that that action plan item was written and proposed was kind of more the model of we would issue an RFP or an expression of interest for a grant for nonprofit housing, sort of following the model of an expression of interest we issued on a portion of lot one. So the model sort of we would issue an RFP or an EOI, we would grant construction for the nonprofit housing development, and we would do a partnership agreement with the nonprofit housing provider. So after this working group report and Housing Advisory Committee recommendation, staff, we met with CMHC to talk about, okay, this might be a different way of fulfilling this item. So instead of issuing an RFP and EOI and issuing a grant and then joint partnership agreement, what if council endorsed the recommendation and entered into a partnership agreement? And so we talked about CMHC, how we could essentially edit our action plan item, and that the Housing Accelerator Fund grant money would be an eligible cost, and you could fund the partnership agreement with the Housing Accelerator Fund money. What else? And then the other thing, so the ultimate staff recommendation that you see in my covering report and sort of in conversation with all of staff is looking for some way to refer this to staff for further review for financial and resource allocation review. So looking at, okay, the money initially is there to fund it from the Housing Accelerator Fund, but wanting a little bit more clarity in terms of what's the staff allocation to do this in the short term, but then so looking at knowing that the Housing Advisory Committee recommendation goes straight through from, in principle, entering the partnership agreement, approve the operating funds, direct staff to work with it, long-term lease for community lands. But it's also, as we sort of reflect on it, so the recommendation to refer back to staff, but also looking at, well, there's potential for council to approve, some of that. So if council wish to, approve the principle of entering into a partnership agreement, that could work, and then, but maybe not jumping fully into the full recommendation, but referring it to staff to, come back with a report on more of the details in those pieces. Yeah, I think those were my opening comments. I'm looking for any questions.
Councilor Wade.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. This has been a long time initiative of mine, and I'm very excited to see it finally getting here. And I think a lot of what you've just said speaks to why we should be doing this. And I was actually hoping we could at least take part of the recommendation and approve the entering into a partnership agreement. And that would allow the work with Lidstone to begin. Staff would be involved in that work, and the deeper questions about where's the funding going to come from, and what's the arrangement going to be with the potential long-term lease, and those things could be worked in the process of developing that partnering agreement. So so I'd like to have a motion that basically suggests that. I haven't written it down yet, so I'll let others comment. Okay.
That's a good idea.
I'm wondering if Councillor Wade could just repeat a little bit of what he just said. The partnership would allow work with Lidstone to begin, and something about portions of a lease, or?
Well, in the recommendation, it talks about, in the recommendation from the Housing Advisory Committee, it talks about approving in principle, providing operational funds for a minimum of 3 years, and Number 4 is council approved in principle allocating through a long-term lease a portion of community lands to Birch to develop housing.
All right, where are you reading from?
This on page 3
Page 23.
23.
or 3?
I've got 14 pages to the HAC recommendation.
Okay, well, I'm in our actual agenda.
The challenge is there's multiple formats of the agenda,
Yeah.
so there's the
Okay.
HTML and the
Yeah.
PDF.
She's in the agenda tab.
So maybe what we'll do for this, for the ease of everybody in the room, maybe I could get the corporate officer to put those recommendations up on the screen.
The recommendation is embedded in the minutes of the Housing Advisory Committee meeting, but yes, I'm just getting it up on screen.
Thank you. You still have the floor, Council Getty.
So, Mr. Martin, the, can't find references in front of me, so just from memory, the money from the, federal government. Settlement fund, so that's 1.65 something million. Is that the same, money that Robin was just referring to in terms of being able to leverage the original seed money from Bowen up to 2 million or is that separate?
Those are separate, those are site-specific funding that Birch Lookout has received for development on that site behind the health center.
So then what we're talking about here, the Birch is on the site close to the medical center, and this is a different area, part of lot 1.
Yes, what this is proposing is one sort of a partnership agreement with Birch. And then specifically looking at development of lot 1 as sort of the next available plans.
All right, so then the 1.65 million on the housing accelerator fund, that can be used in terms of some of the development costs for the expressions of interest or the what is that? That's all the legal requirements in terms of figuring out arrangement between the nonprofit and.
Yes, so the grant application, like some small parts of it are allocated to other initiatives. It's like development of DCC bylaws and permitting and stuff, but the bulk of it, what the grant application had was the bulk of it be available for essentially capital funding of developing affordable housing.
So that's the actual construction capital.
Yeah, I mean, some of it, but its eligible costs are things like operation costs and.
Okay, so in the, excuse me. In the body of the Housing Advisory Committee, they're talking about in that report. They're talking about staffing for, let's see. Executive director in the first year, 50,000, 65, 80,000 in the third year. An admin assist, and that has a footnote to it, so that's part-time. Doesn't say how many hours. The admin assistant, that's 40 hours a month, 35 an hour. And then some future roles. So is that funded by the Housing Advisory Committee? Or sorry, Accelerator Fund?
That's essentially, I think, the gist of the funding that would be funded by the operational funding provided by BIM is essentially the recognition that Birch has been, largely a volunteer organization, right, with some slight funding provided.
I don't have any
Yeah,
problems with the idea of actually paying somebody for all the work that's been done, but is the funding coming from this federal funding for the positions?
yeah, I mean, that's essentially like we had the recommendation from the housing advisory from the working group, right, and saying, okay, this is a sample budget of
Yeah.
140,000 a year. So then as staff, when we're looking at it, where does that funding come from? Right, and the most appropriate bucket seems to be that Housing Accelerator Fund grant that would fund this.
Okay, so this budget that's on page 13 of 14, for the first 3 years, we were able to take that out of that federal funding as operating costs. That's legitimate, we can do that, and that's covered. So then what happens after we've got a new organization, or we've got a new relationship, a partnership, and we've got solid funding. very generous funding in terms of both operating and hopefully a whole bunch left over for construction. Not enough, but some. What happens after the 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, that would be the challenge. So when Squamish renewed, they said their renewal came from a mix of CMHC funding, which they still would carry forward property tax allocation and their housing reserve fund, which is funded by development and I think also by property taxes. Their housing reserve.
So is that what you're suggesting to the staff, that we send it back to staff to get more details on the finances of it? It would be that.
That piece, and I think just the
Because if we've got an organization that's up and working and everybody is satisfied and happy with what they're doing, then to cut off funding or not have funding, then, you know, that's a voluntary organization that's the pitfall of all of us that work in volunteer stuff, and there's no funding for operating costs. So there's lots of funding out there for capital, but not for staff. So if that's what you're suggesting in terms of the staff will be looking for, or trying to figure out and make suggestions, that would be very helpful.
yeah, I think that's one piece of it. The other piece that was a concern for staff was just even the 2024 workload of entering into drafting, laying out the actual partnership agreement piece of it. To adequately review it and bring it and recommend it to council. Yeah, that side of it was sort of, a concern from council, just knowing, or for staff, just knowing sort of the list of strategic initiatives and saying, okay, if this is a priority, then it's taking the place of other priorities.
Thank you.
Councillor Getty, Councillor Jurgensen.
Okay, I just want to say, I very much support this. The province has increasingly downloaded work onto the municipality, and having partners that can work with us towards some of the goals that we have for housing would be fantastic, and very happy with the work that Birch's been doing over the years, and but definitely think that this idea of a partnership is a step in the right direction.
Thank you, Councillor Jurgensen. Councillor Pass.
So this is a question for the planner. So this is my interpretation that this is the step-by-step ironing out or bringing more visibility to the details, is where's the money going to come from? And about where's the time going to come from for staff to do the draft partnership plan and do the collaborative consultation and all that kind of thing. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I would say me as in my community planner hat, I'm very happy with the recommendation, the meeting with Don Lidstone was very clear in terms of this is a successful model that municipalities have used, that sort of relying on volunteer organizations to develop your house. It is a challenging model, relying on municipal staff to develop affordable housing. It is challenging too, and everyone doing it off the side of their desk, that this is a successful model, and having the Housing Accelerator Fund gives us a funding source that can work.
Yeah, thank you. Just if I can make a comment as well, just that I'm in favor of the staff recommendation that's here under 4.1, partly because it helps everybody come along with the project, and for the volunteers to see that, everybody to see where the money and the resources are going to come from. And for us to be following the little lines on the top of our agendas, one of which is encourages and fosters community involvement and those kinds of things. This seems to be part of what Bowen Island does, is work together towards things like this. So I'm in support of the staff recommendation, and because I like the step-by-step idea, and because I wasn't quite clear on what you were referring to in those motions that you were trying to say. Right now, I'm leaning towards the supporting the staff recommendation that's in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Faust. Further questions or discussion? So some of the curiosities that I have are, I really appreciate the work of the Housing Advisory Committee in advancing this. I think the idea of a community-owned housing organization is one that I can support. I'm curious, just from the discussions, maybe Chair Fenton, maybe you can join us up here, just to elucidate some of the conversation that's been happening at the Housing Advisory Committee a little bit better, is explaining it to me like I'm a 5-year-old. How exactly does a model like this get housing built in the community, and how is it different than what Birch is doing now, what the municipality is doing now, and what does that look like, long term? So, from the context of either Birch or the Housing Advisory Committee, what's been the discussion as to how this thing rolls out and how affordable housing actually gets delivered to the community under a model like this?
So I guess to answer the first part, how is this different than what's happening now? So we have Birch, essentially mostly volunteer organization, and there's others doing this. Snugcove House is the exact example. They are also doing this at the moment. So I guess to what, and I think it was Councillor Getty said earlier, is volunteers burnout, right? And actually paying people to do the work, will, I believe, move it faster. Like it will actually happen faster. You're not relying on volunteers who come and go potentially or burn out. So I think that's the idea, is essentially kind of putting money into it will actually further it along at a more accelerated pace. I was very encouraged by the Squamish example, because I believe they've just purchased their first building and they're like 2 years in or something. And so part of their work, and I believe it was shared with us confidentially, so I'm not sure if we're allowed to share it, but part of their work was having a consultant prepare a business plan as to how they could move towards financial sustainability. So to sort of address what was just being asked. And so I think that's the idea, is that an organization, we're all well familiar with the Whistler Housing Organization, which is quite a different beast because Whistler's very different, but look at what they have achieved, right? I know they have a very different funding source and it's a very different model, but they have, they're literally into that, I think a couple thousand, 1,500, 2,000 housing units in the last 20 years. So having an organization that's dedicated to it, that, somebody is paid, it's their job to achieve this, and including it's their job to achieve sort of financial sustainability of the organization, I think will accelerate it. And it's funny, that's the Housing Accelerator Fund, like that's the idea, is can we just dump a bit of money into this and get it moving faster? So it's taken Birch 7 years to get to this point where we got funding approval for that project. So I think the idea would be, if we can, give that boost to the organization, have somebody paid to do doing the work, that hopefully doesn't take another 7 to get to the next one. Maybe we can do it in, 3 or 2, hopefully, but I think that's the idea. And then it's also the longer term, hopefully the model would be that organization, Birch or whoever else it is actually, in my mind, kind of acting also as a bit of a community land bank, not so much in the ownership of the land, because I think that should stay with the municipality, but the property, right? So like you will have these housing units that exist for the community. The organization's not in it for profit. Literally their mandate is, how do we create the housing that the community needs that the market isn't meeting? Because the market will take care of, the nice big houses and the single family homes. There is not much of a market for below market housing, for rentals, for all these other things. So having an organization long-term that is not only trying to meet those needs and build them, also maintaining them long-term, and, over time, rents don't get jacked up just because they can, just because they meet the market and all that stuff. The goal would be to keep them as affordable as possible. So I think there's quite a few benefits of having that organization exist, both in the short term and the long term. Yeah.
And so in the minutes that we have, it in the staff report. So I note that I think that in the original Housing Advisory Committee minutes, there was just in general, like the recommendation was that council approve in principle entering into a a partnering agreement with nonprofit, and then it looks like in the staff report that's advanced to entering into an agreement with Birch. Is that correct?
The history is the working group report recommended a partner agreement with a nonprofit housing society. And then when the housing advisory committee was discussing it, they essentially said, no, we're not proposing just any one, but specifically with Birch. So that came from the housing advisory committee as opposed to the working group report. So the report that's in the agenda is the report from the working group to the housing advisory committee. And then the motion they adopted was specifically with Birch.
Right. And had there been advice from Lidstone already at that point as to the sort of the best shape of a relationship with a nonprofit?
Yeah, I mean, that's what came to the working group.
And then just on the and I just, maybe Chair Fenn, I want to give you permission just to wear both hats at once, the Birch hat and the housing advisory hat, because that's actually helpful in the context of this discussion. So would a partnering agreement with Birch require any changes on Birch's end in terms of articles of incorporation or the way that organization has been incorporated to actually make this work?
It's a great question, and I was going to add into that. This was discussed with Don Lidstone, and he said, in terms of like effort and direct costs, setting up a brand new nonprofit, which of course is an option. I think more staff time, fair to say, but it's an option. Setting up a brand new nonprofit or partnering with an existing one and doing that due diligence, revising their bylaws was essentially about the same. But to directly answer your question, Birch, we anticipate that there will be changes. There will be updates. There might be more specificity about the board makeup, for example, like including a counselor, including a staff liaison, something around those that would obviously be negotiated and worked out during that partner agreement being created. So yes, we definitely anticipate that. In terms of, well, I mean, it'll be a big change in terms of day-to-day operations, obviously, because right now we just kind of make do. I just sort of wear all the hats, right? And the board helps out their working board as well. So does that answer your question?
It does, yep, yep.
I'll just add that, yeah, I mean, Don essentially saying, yeah, they're about the same, like you review it or you start a new one. And I think for the housing advisory committee debate after Robin had recused herself, it was kind of part of the thinking was that Birch is an established nonprofit on Bowen, that people are passionate about affordable housing on Bowen have been part of Birch for 7 years and kept it going. And the feeling of like, why would we create a new, we could create a new society and advertise for new board members, but it felt like people who are passionate about affordable housing on Bowen are probably part of Birch, or a good number part of Birch. Why would we recreate a new organization to do the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would make sense to me as given that we're a small community, I think the Venn diagram of people that are interested in housing are probably already on the housing advisory committee or on Birch. And then in terms of an organization like this in a small community, so I note that the Sunshine Coast example is sort of a partnership between a number of communities. Are there examples of housing organizations that are sort of standalone in communities of this size, and how effective are they?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a challenge because probably every community is a little different. Like as I was doing the report, I was thinking about my experience in Kitimat, which is a community, a bit bigger, but 8,000 or 9,000 lives there. They probably operated more with one-off. So like there was a site that the district owned where we partnered with a housing provider on a specific project, and we funded them to do a project. So we didn't have a formal partnership agreement, but instead we made the land available and sort of coax them through the process to get to the point of getting BC housing funding.
Well, I mean, yeah, you've got the Squamish, you've got the Sunshine Coast. I mean, Tofino is not exactly the same because they sort of went a slightly different route, but essentially kind of, I think, from what I know, in theory, they created an organization. They went, I think, the slightly different model, but through some ups and downs, eventually ended up having that organization partner with an outside source, which I also see this organization, whether it's Birch or not, would do as well, which is kind of what we've done, be a facilitator as well as potentially, actually doing the development themselves, depending on where that model went. Self-sufficient funding. I don't know, Councillor, you seem to sort of, do you have any other off the top of your head that's similar?
I was thinking about Tofino, and actually, in my consulting days, I actually went to Tofino and suggested they do that. And they had a shell, but they just couldn't quite figure out how to get it actually operating. And in the end, they hired a consultant and who then eventually became the general manager. And they were able to partner with Catalyst and they got some housing done that's been quite successful. But taking the whole, if I may, taking the whole conversation a little higher level, and to Councillor Fast's point about having the community involved, and actually to Don Youngston's letter, which I'll speak to later, it's really important to have the whole community, council, and whoever's responsible for actually getting things done, which in this case would be Birch, having them really working together and good communication and feeling support rather than, and we saw this in Whistler a little bit, rather than the housing organization being treated like just another developer. They're not just another developer. They are developing something that we have stated very clearly we need. And I think it's incumbent upon us to support that in any way that we can, within reason. And to Don Lidstone's comments, this has been done a lot of times. I don't think it's going to be too hard. He's got templates of how these agreements work. And there are a lot of things to work out, much of what the questions were about here. What we're trying to do here today is say, can we get started with the process of figuring that stuff out with staff, with Don Lidstone, preparing the draft partnering agreement, and then move forward from there to bring that back to council. And if it makes sense, then we can move forward. But we really need to take this step, I guess is what I'm thinking.
Mhm.
So I have a.
I'm gonna take my reclaim my time, I guess, as they say in the States. So I'm gonna take the floor back. Just to perhaps echo some of the comments and provide some of my own perspective just on the funding aspect of it. So I'm supportive of the recommendation as it's written, and to some degree, I think it'll be 6 one way, half a dozen the other on what we can get to today. Because I do believe, so staff's request is, give us some more time to review the financial pieces and the governance pieces of this. I think that makes sense. My own belief is that I think this should come back for our 2025 strategic planning. I think there's some pieces that should probably be discussed in a closed meeting as they relate to legal opinions and reviews and the way that we structure a contract like that. And I'm also very curious as to how this is going to plug in with MRDT, because MRDT is
Can you remind?
Municipal Regional District Tax, which is on the tax on short-term rentals effectively on Bowen Island, and then can be applied to tourism or affordable housing. That's not a conversation that council's had yet. I think somewhere in the materials that, the last time that it came up that there would be a 50-50 split between tourism and affordable housing. I'll be honest, based on the conversations that we've had with the tourism sector so far, I don't know how much of that money would actually be applied directly to mitigating tourism impacts on the island. And my own personal belief is I think affordable housing is a more pressing issue right now. But at the same time, council needs to have the ability to have that conversation as to what that allocation is going to be. And then also what the funding model of this is. So, I would be supportive of sending this to staff, with an amended recommendation just at the end of the report back is at our 2025 strategic planning session, where we can have the staff comment on this and then advance it from there for 2025, given that there's going to be budget implications there. Yes.
Your Mayor, well, so I just want to provide a little bit of context on this recommendation. So it was, I had discussion with staff on, me coming in, I'm still assessing the work plans of our staff, all the projects that are ongoing. And housing's important, but also infrastructure and their infrastructure deficit is a big issue. And so I need to be able to discuss with staff, and we need to plan on what are the operational and financial ramifications of these new positions vis-a-vis the other things that we have ongoing. So it was more as an opportunity for us to do a little bit of an assessment with staff and our due diligence before we, come forward with endorsing any particular recommendations.
Thank you. And Councillor Gidding.
Okay, so I guess first of all, I'd like to be on record loud and clear. Very strong. Thank you very, very much for both the Housing Advisory Committee and Birch in terms of you've gone deep and this is a lot of really good work and I think it's very, very helpful. This was reminding me of working, I was on the board of the Hearth when we had this terms of reference and a memorandum of understanding in terms of coming up with a new concept with the community center. So it seems to me that there's some similarities there. We've got an existing non-for-profit, and it sounds like we're all in agreement. That might be fleshed out a little bit more in terms of that's an existing organization that is doing good work and has the experience and the interest in community support. There's a major project that you've got going on now. And it sounds like we're looking at possibly a wider jurisdiction, not just a specific project, but giving advice on low-cost housing and best models and best practices and things like that, and figuring out and developing the extent of the support in the community so that it does have long-lasting effects. So is that part of what we're talking about in terms of looking at governance and what the terms of references would be and what this organization, what the partnership and the agreement would be with this and with this entity? A general question, is that part of, I think with Lidstone or with planners or?
So as part of in the agenda package, and I won't even say the PDF name, the number or anything, but in Appendix A, which is all those examples. So here's a sample of what the budget might be, here's a sample of that. Within that document, it gives an example of what the roles and responsibilities might be, and that's exactly it. These aren't definitive, these are, hey, let's talk about it. There is ways that maybe we can help support BIM staff and take some stuff off their plate. I would hope, and in the spirit of what Councillor Wake was saying earlier, I see this as an opportunity where it would be a team. Right? It's not so much you're this here, we're just gonna give you some money, we're a team. And so we have an affordable housing policy, we have some stuff hanging out there, Grafton Lakes hasn't, it's sort of unresolved yet, quite how that's gonna come to fruition. Rezonings come up all the time, right? And how does municipality and staff deal with the affordable housing stuff that's there and even some of the ones that exist and enforcement and turnover? I see that as an opportunity where this organization could actually help and they could be involved and even from the earliest stages, hey, how can we make this work with that affordable housing policy? What's best? Is it cash and lieu? Is it developing this and that? And actually be really part of those discussions and hopefully in a very helpful way and contributing to that and hopefully taking some of that from the planning staff, but very much to be determined. There might be some things on here that aren't appropriate for us to take on and they have to stay with municipal staff. It's just a suggestion, but 100% that's what would be worked out in that partnering agreement.
So then it sounds to me like there's an enormous amount of potential on the table and it's figuring out what fits and what's viable in terms of, we don't have an MRDT bylaw or way of collecting that. And, the business plan in terms of long-term viability and all of these extensions of terms of reference, all of that's on the table. And that's what we need to figure out staff time to work on that as a significant or priority strategy. Right? That's where we are? Okay. I'm getting a nod across the table, so I'll take that as a yes.
The speakers are Councillor Jurgensen.
My apologies if this question has already been addressed somewhere in amongst all the documentation.
Looks like you're done talking, so we'll know.
With regards to the Housing Advisory Committee, is my understanding that this
Zoom us,
partnership
review window.
also have the Housing Advisory Committee rolled up into this agreement, or would the Housing Advisory Committee exist much as it does today, and this would just be another piece to the housing puzzle?
I think that's a good question, and I think that's very much on the table, like it would be to be determined. I know council has lots of committees, and I know there's probably a little bit of a spirit to sort of narrow down the committees if they're all needed, so yeah, I think that's very much to be, it's a great question, Councillor Jurgensen, and it's very much to be determined. If Birch or whatever the organization is would kind of take over that. Because there's referrals, right? That I think is the main thing in my mind is the referrals that come from council to us. As the Housing Advisory Committee, is it appropriate for Birch to take that on and advise, or is it more appropriate to continue to have the committee up for discussion?
We are now unmuted.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Jurgensen. Seeing no further, oh, Councillor Morse.
I'm busy trying to find my the plan we submitted for the Housing Accelerator Fund. My understanding is we had choice of several things we could use it for.
So the Housing Accelerator Fund itself lists like eligible expenses, right?
Yeah.
Quite an expansive list of things you can do. Our grant application itself allocated it to, as I said, primarily the like funding of affordable housing. Like through grant funding, it had a couple for some of the other initiatives, a little bit of money, and then the majority of the money is allocated to that. I think it's initiative 6, which was like provide grant funding to affordable housing projects.
Yeah, but that grant funding could be for the hard building itself.
Yes.
Yeah. Perhaps facilitating the infrastructure that was needed.
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah. So there's other things to spend it. And I guess the other question is, I mean, Tofino's partnering a lot with Catalyst. I mean, why don't we just continue with Lookout? Or why don't we just continue with, you know, we talked to Metro Vancouver Housing or things like that. So there's lots of other options in my mind, still to be explored and answered. Why not?
Councillor Fast.
I'm gonna make the motion. Sure. At 4.1. And we'll see what happens. I move that committee of the whole request council, do I have to do that? Request council to refer the Housing Advisory Committee's community-owned housing organization report to staff for further review for financial and resource allocation review and report back at for the 2025 strategic planning session.
I propose just a small tweak on wording for process. So instead of saying that the committee of the whole refer, just say that council refer. Because the recommendation comes back at the council.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm never sure about the wording at the top.
Yeah, it's always
Things-
tricky. It's always tricky at committee.
Okay.
Because that would be the wording that comes back to council, and it's just a
Oh, and then,
quick
yeah,
vote.
thank you.
So it's been moved by Councillor Fast, seconded by Councillor. Any discussion on the motion? Councillor Wake?
I'd like to propose an amendment. You know, the conversation around the table is very clear. The question today is, do we want to move in this direction? It's not, what's it gonna take to make it work? That's the question we're gonna get to once we can get the ball rolling here. So I would suggest that basically taking number 1 and the last after number 4 is not actually numbered. The council approve in principle entering into a partnering agreement with Bowen Island Resilient Community Housing Merge, a nonprofit society, and council approve expenditure for legal fees and other possible costs for the above up to a maximum of $5,000. This is getting our foot in the door and getting things rolling and allowing staff and Lidstone and potentially consultants, and then bringing that back to the strategic planning. where the bigger decision is gonna be, like, can we do this? This is finding out if we can do it. And it's where it's still,
So before you motivate on the amendment, I'll, so this would come after the existing motion or before the existing motion? Or replace the existing motion?
it would replace things.
Can I hear it again, please? The actual word.
The council approve in principle entering into a partnering agreement with Bowen Island Resilient Community Housing, Merge, a nonprofit housing society, and council approved expenditure for legal fees and other possible costs for the above, up to a maximum of $5,000.
So an amendment has been moved.
Sorry, but I think that's a different motion.
It is a different motion, but I'll just look for a seconder. So I don't see a seconder, so that amendment,
Can I make a suggestion? Is
No.
that,
because there's been a motion, so it hasn't been seconded, so that does not come to the floor.
I'll second.
Okay, seconded by Councillor Jurgensen.
and
I-
then,
I'm just gonna ask for a quick moment to confer with the corporate officer just about secret. So I am going to rule that out of order just because it substantially changes the direction of the motion. So it is more, it's not a simple amendment. But that's not to say that we can't come back to have another motion after this one's discussed. So we're back to the main motion. Is there any discussion on this? And perhaps just for the sake of clarity, we could have that main motion read out again.
So the main motion is that council refer the Housing Advisory Committee's community-owned housing organization report to staff for further review for financial and resource allocation review and to report back for the 2025 strategic planning session.
So we're on this as a main motion. Any discussion? Councillor Saunders, followed by Councillor Getty.
This, my only question would be is do we need to be more specific about what that financial review is looking for? I don't know, asking the question, I'm not pretty sure. Is that broad? Is that too broad, like financial? Or is that, does everybody understand what we're talking about here? How are we gonna fund this down the road? So
Right, so perhaps before I send that to staff for a response, are there specific things in that review that you would like to see that you feel aren't contained with specificity in the existing motion?
I would think that the long-term operational costing and funding for that, like the report outlines 3 years. But without this, you know, there's some assumptions in that 3-year budget as well, as any budget. But I would like if the financial implications get looked at beyond those first 3 years for the operational costs, because as Councillor Getty pointed out, like it's hard to get operational money in grants and things like that. You get capital money typically, but once this is up and running, it's going to be an operational cost that we have to address. And I just want, so that council, when voting on something like this, would know, okay, are we going to have to budget for something like this moving forward? We're going to have to budget $150,000 to $200,000 a year for operational costs.
Okay, and then just back to staff, given that this is a staff recommendation in large part that we're moving, you know, based on Councillor Saunders' comments, what would you anticipate coming back with in terms of the financial and resource review?
Yeah, I think part of that's going to have to be based on discussion we have internally. I think the idea is to present a fulsome picture of how it's going to impact. There might be different models of, like, so the request is for the organization to fund these positions for 3 years. Within that, you know, we need to see, like, you know, beyond 3 years, if we need to extend that, what's going to be the operational kind of stress on the organization in terms of the funding there. You know, once the housing authorities up and running and they have units, would continuing those positions onward that involve the revenues collected by the housing authority to offset the cost of those positions. Would they, you know, there's a lot of financial ramification that we have to sort of.
That's the level of where staff would go with that, and I'm
Yeah.
very satisfied with that, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Getty.
So this motion talks about financial and resource allocation, so that's of particular interest to the staff and strategic planning. We've also talked about governance and the potential, what the terms of reference of such an organization is. That going to be included in the staff report, or could it be? Should it be added to this resolution? The next step farther away, farther down.
I'm just the chair. I don't have a specific opinion, so I'll refer it over to staff.
I mean, I would think that would tend to be the next step. That's kind of when we're reviewing a partnership agreement.
Any other discussion on the main motion? Seeing none, I will call the question. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Hi.
Aye. Any opposed?
Aye.
And that carries unanimously, and Councillor Lake, I will on the floor have you.
I would like,
Audio now and
we still, there's a huge discussion we need to have. And as I understand it, it's going to be focused initially around the partnering agreement. That's where we're gonna work through the governance, in the review of Birch's existing bylaws, constitution articles. See if we need to make any changes. And the legal advice we're gonna get from Don Lidstone is really gonna help us determine that. So I would just like to add a little preamble to what I moved before, and say, in preparation for the work that staff will do in order to report back to council. Council approved in principle entering into a partnering agreement with Owen Island Resilient Community Housing, Birch, a nonprofit society, with the help of Don Lidstone. And secondly, council approved expenditure for legal fees and other possible costs for the above, up to a maximum of $5,000.
I think the corporate office can put that up on the screen. Councillor Prest?
Second.
Second. Moved and seconded, an amendment from Councillor Getty.
So I'm not sure that you should specifically mention Lidstone. He might be our favorite and our best bet, and someone that we've worked with before, but that might have to change for any number of reasons. So just legal counsel.
Okay, so an amendment to replace Don Lidstone with legal counsel. Seconded by Councillor Saunders. There we go. Any discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
audio now unmuted.
Aye.
That carries. We're back to the main motion. Any discussion on the main motion? Councillor Getty.
So basically, this is giving some sort of support to Birch in terms of saying that that's our choice in terms of this nonprofit organization, and that we're encouraging them to continue at the same time that staff is working on the other. So they'll work on some of the governance and the terms of reference and some of those other items at the same time that the staff are working on long-term financial. Is that the understanding?
Yeah, Birch will also be working with staff and legal counsel to sort of all of it. So this is.
Councillor Prest.
I'm speaking in favor of the motion. I'm also really liking the part about a proven principle to entering a partnership agreement with Birch. They've done all this amazing work so far, and I want to give them confidence that their work is being recognized and that that's the direction council is going with this. So I'm in favor for the other reasons too.
Thank you. Any further discussion on the motion? The only hesitancy I have, and I'm trying to let the discussion settle in me right now, is looking back to the original motion as presented from the Housing Advisory Committee, where it just stated approving a principal entering into a partnering agreement with a nonprofit organization.
Minutes of the Housing Advisory Committee were very specific.
Right.
So that's the original motion came out of.
Yes, I know. So let me explain my reasoning here. But I am also sensitive to Councillor Morris's comments about the potential role of other organizations or the analysis of whether the Metro Vancouver Housing Corporation has a role to play. We do know that Lookout will be operating on the island at some point. My only concern is, are we and also uncertain what the implications are going to be to Birch as they update their own articles of incorporation. Does it make sense at this juncture to explicitly specify Birch, or do we want to leave it open for staff as they explore, just that we approve in principle entering a partnering agreement with a nonprofit organization generally? Councillor Fest?
Or organizations, plural, which I think I heard referred to. I would be open to an amendment that's replaced that followed the Housing Advisory Committee. That's fine with me. I just want to acknowledge all the work that the volunteers and the people in the community have been doing.
And to be clear, I think, when I look at the Housing Advisory Committee minutes, it does explicitly specify Birch, so that is the recommendation that did come to us. So it has been discussed. I'm only slightly mixed and just presencing the point of conversation. Councillor Wade followed by Councillor Getty.
So all those things you suggested, partnering with Metro Vancouver Housing Corporation, partnering with Lookout, partnering with Catalyst, those can all still happen and are likely to happen, but they're going to happen through Birch, which is now going to be a professional organization that's going to have a business plan and do the legwork for us that we can't do as a council, staff can't do. We don't have a housing department, but they never work anyway. So we're not ruling out all those partnerships that you've talked about. And in fact, we're probably going to encourage them, but they'll be done just as the partnership with Lookout was done. They'll be done through Birch.
Councillor Getty.
I think we're narrowing it down to Birch for all the reasons that were discussed at the Housing Advisory Committee. So rather than starting up a new organization and figuring out the board and whether or not we've got enough volunteers for two organizations, whether that weakens one and puts more emphasis on another, and whether there's other organizations out there that we haven't identified clearly enough in the 2 or 3 years that we've been working on this or more. It seems to me that we're narrowing it down for the purpose of getting Birch to look at, we're agreeing in principle to setting up a partnership agreement. And that was going to require Birch, with the help of $5,000 worth of legal opinions, to come up with some sort of a model, whether it's working or not. And that's a later discussion.
Okay. I don't see any further discussion on this, so I will call the question. All in favor, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All opposed, raise your hand and say nay.
Aye in favor.
And that carries with Councillor Morris in opposition. Thank you, Chair Fenton. Next up, moving on to 5.1 Strategic Initiatives Progress Report. We have our report here on the agenda, and I'll turn it over to our CEO for commentary.
Thank you, Mayor. So this is the table on the strategic actions that staff have been undertaken. We have, if there's any questions on any particular point on the table, then I could attempt to answer them, or I can direct you to the appropriate department lead.
Okay. I'll look to council for any questions or comments. Councillor Wick, hand up first, followed by Councillor Morse.
Just a minor correction, I think, under the official community plan. The first initiative, says consultant selected by council kickoff meeting with the steering committee scheduled for October 21st, which is today, and I think it's actually next to 29th.
Yes, that is accurate. We did not have a kickoff meeting today. Thank you for that, Councillor Wick. Councillor Morse.
That was going to be one of my comments, and really is, I know the very first line says as of October 15th, but it's probably more like as of October 1st. Because didn't we have a council meeting? When was the date of our last council meeting?
15th.
October 15th, and so there were some decisions made where it says in progress that now they're finished, so I'm, just a little concerned about some of those things. I had picked up, it was October 29th for me. The other thing I thought was the consultant was selected and recommended to council by the steering committee. So saying selected by council, it's more rude. It's me and semantics and giving credit to the steering committee. Okay, so some of these things have happened. And then DCC bylaw, I'm under revenue, DCC bylaw and development, whereabouts is it in the law? Is it just starting, or is it almost ready, or?
Yeah, through the mayor. So I have had some internal engagement. A lot of that was just me figuring out where the previous CEO had left things off and working with staff such as the CFO and director of engineering to see how we progress that. So it's just a matter of me trying to pick it up from where the previous CEO had left it off. And I'm still kind of learning what has been done and trying to figure out a plan to move forward amongst the many other things that are happening.
So it's not a fait accompli, which is good in my mind. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I had some notes here. So there was just a quick update on the revenue portion. So we had advocate for inclusion in the Islands Coastal Economic Trust. The action was no action on ICT. BCM minister meeting was requested. We just received a letter a couple of days ago from the Jobs and Economic Development Ministry that said they have declined our request to be included in the Islands Coastal Economic Trust. I forwarded that to council earlier today, so that will be included in a future agenda, which is unfortunate. MRDT we talked about a little bit today. Something I would like to flag that I am considering is possibly at a future meeting of council, perhaps noticing a motion around we discussed issues around traffic and parking and things like that in Snug Cove. I think the ongoing issues in the that we saw in the summer and that we've seen just last weekend and that we've seen some of the work in the Cove is going to demand a solution for traffic and parking and ferry control and marshalling and signage and crosshatching and all of that in the Cove by next summer. So I would like to, not at this meeting, but just signal to council that open to having discussions on that and noticing a motion that would direct staff to do a little bit of pre-work prior to our strategic planning 2025 in preparation of having some sort of solution in some way, shape or form that can be deployed for next summer, by the time we reach peak season. I don't believe that residents can live through another spring and summer and peak season as is with the existing traffic control, ferry marshalling, et cetera, that exists down in the cove. And it's something that we do need to address before next summer. Otherwise, it will be at our peril and our reputation as a municipality. So that's just a piece I wanted to comment on, to signal to council that we should, that I'll be bringing forward some work to do prior to strategic planning. And I think that was everything I had in commentary on the strategic plan. The only other piece regarding the asset management plan. So in a previous budget, we did I think the only headcount moves we did approve as a council was adding staff to Public Works to do some asset management planning. That was a year and a half ago at this point. We did receive an update to the Mayor's Task Force on Infrastructure about asset management planning. I would, for strategic planning 2025, like to signal to staff that that's a conversation that I would like to pick up. I believe that with added headcount and being this far along, council is due for an update on asset management planning. I know that our CAO, with his deep expertise in asset management planning, is looking into this. But it is something that I think we need to highlight as we go into 2025, exactly what we're doing, where we are, and when that planning is expected to be complete, particularly given the fact that in our 5-year financial plans, we are increasing tax rates significantly to residents. And a large part of that money is going into capital renewal and replacement. I think the community is going to be very interested, and council is going to be very interested into, like, what is the plan for those funds? Where's that going to go, and how are we going to use that moving forward? So that's just a comment on our asset management piece. And that's it for me. Councilor Getty.
So in the third item here, engage community and effective government, the first bullet is First Nations engagement, and it indicated that hosted Squamish Nation members consulting on beach renaming on a tour of the 2 sites. So I haven't heard about that, and I'm quite interested in terms of how that went and whether or not that was in response to a request to their portal. And I'm wondering if we can build on that relationship in terms of not specific to a naming situation, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff. So I've been thinking we should organize a road trip and go up and arrange a breakfast or something to setting up some sort of a meeting. But if that's our first actual working meeting, I'd be interested in how that went.
Any commentary on that piece from staff at all? Over to our manager of Parks and Environment.
Yeah, I just wanted to include, that was me. I hosted those members that came over, and we took a little tour around the island. The request was directly to their language department, who we've used before for translations for interpretive signage in some of our parks. And they asked if they could come and have a tour, and I blushed.
Okay.
Over to our CEO.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I know this is kind of a retrospective report of the last quarter and the things, but in terms of First Nations engagement, I just want to point out that this week we're doing a full day of corporate training on, yeah, exactly. So we'll be able to report on that in the next quarter. So we're starting to do work on that as well.
And is that with Squamish Nation representatives?
I haven't said it. Corporate officer, do you know?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's being set up through our human resources, so I can come back and answer that question.
Just a question, perhaps to our manager of planning. I cannot remember. Do we have? Did we put in an application for community funding?
We had initial discussions with the Squamish, but couldn't we needed council resolution and Squamish endorsement before September deadline, and couldn't do it.
Thank you. Councilor Morris.
I just remembered the other thing I was going to mention. I think we actually adopted the Murray Trade bylaws at the last council meeting. So if this is as of October 15th, they were adopted as of October 15th.
report before the
I know
council
that's
meeting.
why I said you should have said October first.
Councillor Wake. Oh, sorry, Councillor Morris.
I have one more question. So do we have names from the Squamish Nation for the beaches?
Not yet.
Councillor Wake.
Back to the first section, under public transit. We are still working on the Rural Transit Solutions Fund application. So getting is leading that. But the point number one, Mayor and Councilor Wake and CAO met with Translink in the spring of 2024. And I think it's time for us to revisit that meeting and their response and try to get to some specific asks on how we can expand our transit system.
Just in response to that, until TransLink settles with the province as to what the funding solution is going to be, any discussions with TransLink on planning or it's going to be a level alone. So my advice to council would be let's wait until probably first or second quarter in 2025, once the new government gets installed and TransLink has pushed forward its 2025 investment plan and has sought advice from the province as to what's going to happen in 2026 for any discussion on service improvements. The one piece I'll update, which is worth mentioning here on our strategic plan, which I neglected to mention, was in 2 is advocate for improved ferry services, including electric passenger ferry. I do want to update council to a meeting that I had on Friday in Vancouver with Green Line Ferries. Joining us at that meeting were Mayor White from Gibson's. We had the chair of the Vancouver Park Board. We had a Vancouver councillor as well as our MP Patrick Weiler, who was at that meeting. And Green Line Ferries is moving forward. So their business model is still reportedly sound. They still are targeting a 2026 to 2027 service start date. Their main hiccup is finding a landing spot in downtown Vancouver. So their discussions with site owners continue, and we had a very productive meeting with particularly the Vancouver folks, both from the park board as well as city council, as to potential options there. So as far as I know, that is moving forward. I have not heard anything. Don't believe staff has heard anything about the Seymour Bay landing that Green Line had originally proposed or plans there. I'm sure that will come back to council at some point. But I'll be curious as to where that moves for Bowen Island.
Just curious as an update from one thing telling you, obviously the landing spots is a critical thing, but where are they in terms of purchasing the ships themselves? Is that sort of they're on the sideline, we're ready to go as soon as we have the funding and everything else in place?
Yeah, so the indication that I've had, and I want to be cautious not to speak for Green Line as a representative, is that they're ready to purchase boats and that they have financing arranged.
But is there like a 5-year lead time on a boat, or you may not know any of that?
I believe it's their longest lead item.
Yeah.
And they're the only thing they're waiting for, from my understanding, is confirmation on a Vancouver landing site, which would let them place that order.
Thank you.
Councilor Getty, or sorry.
Sorry, I just want to, through the mayor to Councilor Getty, the training, the Indigenous training that you asked about earlier, it's being put on by the Indigenous Corporate Training Incorporated. So they're a company founded by Bob Joseph, who's on the Vancouver Island and does this type of thing. Government's all through BC. So they're a great, respected provider of this training.
To get back to Greenland, they put out a survey asking for people's preferences for landing spots in all around the Vancouver area. So if you haven't taken it, I suggest that you look up their website and give them some input.
Councilor Morris.
I got a news release from them on Tuesday and it had a link to the survey. And they're fairly looking like they were getting fairly far down the route for getting the boats built. And they're creating a design for the charging ports with BC Hydro for charging the boats. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I'll forward that to everybody.
Thank you. Any further discussion on our strategic plan before I look for a motion to receive? Councillor Fast.
I'm just gonna make the motion.
Absolutely.
That council received the strategic initiatives progress report dated October 15, 2024 for information.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor, raise your hand, say aye.
Aye.
And that carries unanimously. Councillor Getty.
If I can just give a word of thanks to our new CEO for plowing through that long list. It's a steep learning curve and all getting on board with all of our stuff. So,
Thank you.
Thanks. Our hope is that we're gonna start moving towards a more of a user-friendly quarterly reporting format with more photos of the work that's being done. Like, for example, all the great work that Public Works crews did over the weekend, trying to make sure drainage was running. So yeah, we're in a kind of transition process, but yeah, thanks to staff for putting this together and helping out the new guy.
Awesome. Thank you. 5.2 legislative requirements of Bill 44. We have our manager of planning and development here.
Thank you, Mayor. So this came out of work, I mean, as you're aware, the province adopted a series of housing legislation in the last year. And one of the requirements that the municipality had to do was a bylaw to approve secondary suites in every zone. And part of our discussion with the Advisory Planning Commission, they just wanted to highlight and have more clarity and discussion about what are the implications if we reach a population of 5,000. And so we wanted to sort of just lay it out in one report here for council to reference. And you know, to keep it brief, in Bill 44, there's a requirement for what's called small scale multi-unit housing, or SMU. And that's a requirement that if a municipality, a local government is over 5,000 in population, there's certain requirements and minimum units that have to be permitted on parcels. Interestingly, it's specific that it only applies to land that is served by both municipal water and municipal sewer. I think that was sometimes a point of confusion, but it's pretty clear in the legislation. That's the requirement. So in terms of Bowen, that would be looking almost exclusively like Kate's Hill would be the requirement if we became a population of 5,000. The piece that's sort of unknown at this point is, so the way the legislation and the regulations work is that it's triggered by a census population of over 5,000. But what's unclear is that like in Bill 44, it lays out when the bill comes into effect, when you need to adopt your zoning changes by, and it gives a timeline, and it gave a timeline for when municipalities could seek exemptions from it. And there's sort of set timelines, and we've asked provincial staff, you know, how that would work in terms of the next census, knowing that, you know, that's when it may happen. Next census is in 2026, and we would anticipate data release early 2027. And sort of highlighting for the province that, you know, according to the legislation, well, the moment that the census population dropped, it'd be like, oh, well, it's not in compliance, and sort of saying, well, we would want the same timeline put in place if that happens, as was in place when it was adopted. And I know this is an issue or a concern as well for Gibson's, is in similar population, they're slightly larger than us, and they're closer to then looking at the next census, they might be over 5,000. Yeah, and so as I say in the report, if we were to reach 5,000, like if that were to happen today, we would be seeking an exemption. We'd be saying that there's no capacity in the sewer. And currently, you know, Cove Bay Water has challenges as well. We would be seeking an exemption saying that we're not able to comply at this point, and we need a timeline to come to provide more capacity to meet those requirements. And so the recommendation in the report is just the committee of the whole receive this report for information.
Any questions from the planner? Councillor Getty.
So this is the one that I was concerned about before. So 280 square meters is very, very small, and it gives a minimum of 3 units. So I would also be interested at some point, if we're going to get into further analysis of the implications of Bill 44, how many units, how many lots that we've got that might be subject to this. So if it's all of Kate's Hill, you know, all of the Cove, just where exactly this might fit in terms of sewer and water. And if it were allowed, what that capacity would be in terms of what would be required for water and sewage. So not a priority in terms of, but at some point to keep that in mind, because I think that if we're, preserving and protecting, one of the things is capacity. And that's a potentially quite a significant instance, if you've got all the lots on Kate's Hill that can have up to 3 units. For instance.
Yeah, so I think, that would be part of the analysis of like, okay, now this requirement applies to us. I mean, I'll note that Kate's Hill, you're currently allowed 2 units. Right, so it would be an increase of 1 for each of the lots in Kate's Hill.
And this is talking about 280 square meters is a minimum of 3.
Yeah, so I'm saying right now in Kate's Hill, you can have a house and a secondary dwelling, so you're already allowed 2 dwellings.
Yeah.
How many square feet is 280 square meter?
It's 3,000.
Yeah.
90 square meters is around 1,000 feet.
So a 30 by 100 lot.
Yeah.
Okay. Based on planning's data, what census are we expected to cross 5,000?
Yeah, so in my report, I said, based on the growth from 2021 to 2026, it would see us at 4,922 in 2026. So close enough to be one way or the other. BC stats, the population estimates have us above that growth rate. But I think some of that is because they base it on regional growth, and they allocate based on percentages. So they see Bowen with a higher growth rate, but I'm not clear how much that's based on actual growth rate or just based on like, well, the population of BC has gone up by this much and accordingly. Whereas in the report, like a large amount of our growth from 2021 to 2026 was based on conversion of part-time.
2016 to 2020.
Thank you. Yes. Past historic growth rate, was conversion of part-time residents to full-time residents. And it was about half the stock of part-time residents were converted to. No, half our growth came from that conversion. So it gets more challenging to see a similar growth. Just because now it's about 85% of the dwellings in Bowen are full-time residents. So that there's a smaller pool of part-time residents that would be converted. And then it's sort of seeing, well, what's the shift from COVID and sort of like return to work policies, I think is impacting people in Bowen as well. So, but yeah, when you do this straight, like, okay, if it increases the same amount, then yeah, it's at 80 people less. And then it starts to get into like, well, where people who are part-time on Bowen, part-time elsewhere, where are they saying is their full-time resident? It starts to make a difference.
Okay. What might come in?
So my,
In the wire.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll look to council for a motion to receive if I'm seeing no further discussion. Moved by Councillor Getty, seconded by Councillor Morse. Any discussion? All in favor, raise your hand, say aye. Carries unanimously. And can I have someone move the motion for a closed meeting? Moved by Councillor Getty, seconded by Councillor Saunders. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, raise your hand, say aye. And that carries. And finally, a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Wade. Seconded by Councillor Getty. All in favor, opposed, and that carries. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We will take a 10-minute break and then reconvene.